let me give you one moment of formal introduction. You are a great historian. We know that from your writings, and a fellow of the Economic Policy Institute, the Thurgood Marshall Institute, and the Haas Institute at the University of California at Berkeley. So many institutional affiliations. Richard, thank you for being with the book club.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. You know, when you're an old retired guy, you get lots of useless titles. So thank you for reciting all of them.
Well, those are not useless because those are important affiliations that you've had professionally through a long and very distinguished career.
Thank you.
You wrote this book after pondering these issues of race in America, also through extensive writing about schools as well, and segregation in schools and inequality in school outcomes. You knew a lot, but this book is so filled with unbelievable detail and facts. Was it an adventure for you writing this, or shocking to learn what you found?
Well, you know, nobody writes a book without having an idea that you're going to come up with something useful after spending all that time. But what I was shocked about was not the individual instances of state-sponsored segregation of this society, but the way in which this was a system with so many different federal, state, and local policies, all racially explicit, that were designed to ensure that African Americans and whites could not live near one another in any metropolitan area. It was the system that shocked me, not the individual instances. You know, I began 60 years ago. I was a research assistant at the Chicago Urban League, and involved in a lawsuit that the Chicago Urban League was pursuing against the Chicago Housing Authority for creating housing for African Americans in Black neighborhoods and housing for whites in white neighborhoods. This was at a period when public housing was white as well as Black, but always segregated. So I had an idea from throughout my adult life that there was something going on there more than this myth we have of de facto segregation, that there was some federal involvement in it. But I had no idea the extent to which it was, the many policies that were implemented and how they reinforced each other at all levels of government to create an apartheid society that we have today in this country.
I think that is the overpowering story that you tell, is how many different ways actions were taken at the local level, the state level, the federal level, by agencies, by courts, by police, by special housing authorities and housing agencies to create this kind of segregated nation that we have. And because we have people listening from all parts of the world and also from all different backgrounds, I think it would be great to start with where you do start in the preface of The Color of Law, explaining the difference of de facto segregation and de jure segregation, and what your argument is in this book. We have a segregated society in the United States. We have still today suburbs that are almost entirely white. We have concentrations of residential areas that are African American or white. So the segregation is part of our reality today. But your message is this is a created structure. This wasn't the result of millions of individual decisions, what's called de facto segregation, but as part of a system, as you said. So if you could explain what those terms mean.
Sure.
And why you find this case of de jure segregation so striking in view of America's constitutional laws and values, that would be extremely helpful to get us started.
Sure. As you noted, Jeffrey, we have a myth in this country, and it's widely shared by Democrats and Republicans, by blacks and whites, by liberals and conservatives, by Northerners and Southerners. The notion is that the reason we have a segregated society is because of private activity, because private homeowners or landlords refuse to rent or sell to African Americans in white neighborhoods, or maybe businesses in the private economy like banks or real estate agencies, developers discriminated in how they carried out their work. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's because, people just like to live with each other of the same race. We're more comfortable that way, and that's why we're segregated. Or maybe we say that it's all income differences. On average, African Americans have lower incomes than whites, so many African Americans can't afford to move to middle-class neighborhoods. All of these individual, bigoted, but non-governmental decisions is the reason we have segregation. It's very different, we tell ourselves, from the government-required segregation that we had in the 20th century of schools or lunch counters or buses. We give a name to this myth, as you say. We call it de facto segregation. It has enormous consequences, this belief, because if it's de facto segregation, something that was created by private activity, not governmentally created, it's not a civil rights violation. It's not a violation of the Constitution. If government were doing it, as it was in all the institutions that were segregated in the 20th century, the federal government was doing it, it was a Fifth Amendment violation when, for example, it was segregating interstate transportation. When state and local governments were doing it, it was a 14th Amendment violation when they were segregating schools or lunch counters or public facilities. And we understand that if we have a constitutional violation, a civil rights violation, we have an obligation as American citizens to remedy it. If it happens,
so that is de jure segregation by law.
That's correct. That's correct. If it's not government sponsored, if it's simply de facto, then we have no obligation to remedy it. We may think it's too bad, but we don't have any obligation to remedy it under our Constitution. So the historical account of how government created this segregation is absolutely essential to how we move forward, because the myth of de facto segregation paralyzes our ability to fix it. If we understand that it's government created, then we have as American citizens to accept an obligation to fix it. And as you said, the consequences of these 20th century policies are with us still today. It's not just a historical curiosity. If I can take a minute and explain just one of them that has enormous consequence, one that you referred to, in the post-World War II period, millions of returning war veterans were coming home needing housing. The Federal Housing Administration embarked on a program to move all of the white returning war veterans, as well as other working class families, into all white single family home suburbs, and prohibit African Americans from doing so. And at the time, as many of your viewers or listeners may know, we were an urban society. There were very few people living in suburbs prior to that post-war period. We were a manufacturing economy, and factories had to be located near deep water ports or railroad terminals to get their parts or ship their final products. So you had both black and white workers living in downtown urban areas, much more integrated than they are today. We'd be stunned if we were transported back to that time to see the extent of downtown urban integration that we had. Well, the federal government, the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, embarked on a program to move the whites out of those urban areas into single family homes in all white suburbs and prohibit African Americans from doing so. And I'm sure you're familiar with many of these suburbs. They're all over the country. Every metropolitan area has them.
I grew up in Detroit, so I'm completely familiar with that, because Detroit is almost the paradigmatic case of this, of a core city, African American and white suburbs, and constructed that way with the 8 Mile line, which Eminem made famous, the rapper, in his movie. But out beyond 8 Mile, which measured the distance to the center city, was white, and south of 8 Mile was African American.
Well, I don't want to disillusion you, Jeffrey, but Every place I've gone to, people tell me that their community is the paradigmatic case
Yes.
of segregation. Detroit has no monopoly on that view. So for example, take Levittown, which is the one that I talk about most in this book, east of New York City, where you are now. And I'm not suggesting that there wasn't private bigotry involved. Of course there was. Levitt was a bigot. He wouldn't have sold homes in Levittown to African Americans if he had a choice. But he couldn't build the homes on his own. He went to banks. Nobody would lend him the money. It was a crazy idea.
We should describe that image of what Levittown is, which is the post-World War II house side by side in a new development. Built
17,000 homes in one place. They say no bank would be crazy enough to lend Levitt the money to do this. The only way you could do it was by going to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, submitting his proposal for this development, including a required commitment that he never sell a home to an African American. The Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration even required Levitt and developers like this all over the country to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. Once he made those commitments, the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration guaranteed his bank loans, permitting him to build this project. Now, I say he was a bigot, but is this private discrimination? No. If the federal government had said to him, we'll guarantee your bank loans on condition that you sell without discrimination, like it or not, he would have had to do it. And that's why I say that although he was a bigot, this was a federally required condition. It was an unconstitutional system. And the reason that that's with us today, and I'll just tell you this and stop on this particular story, but the reason that's with us today is those homes at the time that in Levittown and in communities all over the country, they sold at the time for, well, in about 1950, it was about $9,000 a piece, about twice average median income, median family income. About $100,000 in today's inflation-adjusted dollars. Those homes no longer sell for $100,000 anywhere in the country, in any of these suburbs. Not in Detroit, not in New York, not in San Francisco. But now $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. I wrote an article a few months ago in the Times about a community, an all-white community created in the 1940s, where the homes now sell for $1.5 million, $100,000 homes. The white families who moved into those homes with this federal subsidy gained, of course, equity, wealth from the appreciation and value of their homes over the next couple of generations. African Americans were prohibited by explicit federal racial policy from participating in this wealth-generating program. The result is that today, African American incomes, on average, are about 60% of white incomes. African American wealth, household wealth, is about 5% of white household wealth. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that continues to determine the racial landscape of today and so much more of our inequality. That wealth gap is responsible for achievement gaps in schools, for health disparities between African Americans and whites, for the continued inability of African Americans today to move into communities that they could have afforded to move into 60, 70 years ago.
The case that this is a created system is overpowering, and the message of the book is so striking. And I wanted to share with you a reflection that it generated for me. You know, I'm trained as an economist, so obviously I went through formal training where we talked about issues like this in school. And I read already, it's shocking to say, but almost 50 years ago, what was considered a path-breaking book at the time by Gary Becker, who was a professor at University of Chicago, a Nobel laureate, who wrote a book about discrimination. And the whole point of the book was that this is about individual tastes in the marketplace. There's no mention of public policy in the book. After reading The Color of Law, I went back this year for the first time in almost 50 years to Gary Becker's book. It, by the way, doesn't even mention slavery. It doesn't mention the civil rights movement, though it was written in 1957 and then with a new edition in the 1970s. Completely divorced from reality and completely a message that what we see is the result of individual market-based preferences, people choosing to do something. Now that won a Nobel Prize. That is weird. But then there's another one, which was a friend and a colleague of mine who wrote perhaps an equally influential piece in 1968, I believe it is, Tom Schelling, another Nobel laureate, a very nice man, late economist who passed away. But he wrote a very influential academic paper saying, take a checkerboard and put pieces on the board, white and black pieces, if you will, and then move them around based on the assumption that a piece will move if it isn't close to a relative proportion of its own kind. So the idea that whites would like to live a little bit more with whites than they do with African Americans. Blacks would like to live a little bit more with the African Americans than with whites. And then he showed what is true statistically, which is that small differences of preference can lead to self-organizing behavior. That's a theoretical proposition, maybe about how some particles might move or pieces on a chessboard, but it became totemic in professional thinking that, oh, therefore discrimination is just a matter of preferences. Segregation is just a matter of preferences. And that was considered an insight devoid of any of the evidence. And this is also how this mindset seems to work, not only in the general public debate, but even in professional, academic, theoretical circles, to look at what is really glaring injustice and say, that's just a matter of people sorting themselves out. So I wanted to add, I went through that, not only in the casual training, but in the rigorous professional training as well. And I look back at that as rather shocking because this was not only what we were taught, but what was lauded in the academic research. And your book blows up the entire, that entire scenario. But if we could go back to the start for a moment, especially for all of the book club listeners joining from all over the world, can you explain what the 5th, 13th, and 14th Amendments are very briefly, just to give a picture of what America claims to be on paper or in our constitutional order, so that we can then contrast it with the many ways that it is not what it claims to be?
Sure. The Fifth Amendment to the Constitution is the amendment that requires all Americans to be treated with due process and equal protection of the law. And so if the federal government, as in the case I was talking about before, requires that a developer not sell to African Americans, it's violating its Fifth Amendment responsibilities. It's a constitutional violation, a civil rights violation. The 14th Amendment applies those Fifth Amendment protections to the states and to their local governments, as well as requiring that African Americans, the freed slaves and their descendants, get full citizenship rights.
And just to be clear to the listeners, that 14th Amendment, together with the 13th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution were in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War.
That's correct. That's correct. And so the 14th Amendment requires state and local governments to treat all citizens equally in the same way that the Fifth Amendment requires the federal government to do it. The 13th Amendment is actually quite interesting and gets a lot less attention these days.
Yeah, that was fascinating to read about that. So please explain that.
The 13th Amendment not only prohibited slavery, it ended slavery in this country at the end of the Civil War, but also required that the characteristics of slavery be prohibited. In other words, it prohibited any form of second-class citizenship in this country. So all of the activities that you and I have been talking about, implemented by federal, state, and local governments to require segregation, were also a violation of the 13th Amendment, which prohibits second-class citizenship. These are all examples of second-class citizenship when African Americans don't have the same rights to purchase or rent property or sell property that whites have. Two different classes of citizenship.
One of the stories or threads running through the book is how inconsistent the Supreme Court is in recognizing those rights. The Supreme Court's supposed to be the upholder of these constitutional values. And I think it's right to say that the 13th Amendment, which, as you say, was to eliminate the vestiges of slavery, when the Supreme Court looked at that, I believe it was in 1883, if I remember from the book, said, no, that doesn't apply to housing. So, but that's a story that you tell repeatedly, how disappointing the Supreme Court is on so many occasions, basically reflecting the bigotry in the country rather than the constitutional order.
Well, as you noted earlier when you introduced me, before I got to this topic about 10 years ago, I was an education policy writer. I really wasn't focused on this. I came to understand that the biggest problem facing American public schools today was their segregation, where we concentrate the most disadvantaged young people in single schools, where their social and economic disadvantages overwhelm the ability of the schools to focus on instruction the way they can in a school where children come healthy and well-rested and well-nourished and in secure homes. So this was what I was writing about, and I realized that the schools are segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. And then in 2007, I read a Supreme Court decision. This gets to the question you're asking. I read a Supreme Court decision that evaluated two school districts that were attempting in a very trivial way to address the segregation of their students. Seattle, Washington was one, Louisville, Kentucky was another. Both of those districts allowed parents to choose the school within the district that their child would attend, but if their choice was going to exacerbate the segregation of the school, that choice would not be honored in favor of the choice of a child who wouldn't. So if you had, one place left in the school, an all-white school, and both a black and a white child applied for that last remaining place, so that the black child would be given some preference. It was a very trivial program. Supreme Court denounced it. This was 2007. Said you couldn't do such a thing. The decision was written by Chief Justice John Roberts.
My classmate, by the way, at Harvard.
Well, I don't know that I'd be so proud of that.
I'm not proud of it. I'm just recording it.
Anyhow, Chief Justice Roberts wrote the decision. He acknowledged that the schools in Louisville and Seattle were segregated. He said that they were segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located were segregated. And then he went on to say that the neighborhoods in those two cities are segregated de facto for all the reasons that we talked about before: private bigotry, private businesses, people's self-choice, income differences. And he said if you have de facto segregation, the Constitution prohibits the government from taking explicit policies to rectify it. Well, I read this decision, and as you can tell, I've been around a while, so I remembered some years before reading about something that happened in Louisville, Kentucky, one of those two school districts. There was a white homeowner in an all-white suburb called Shively outside Louisville, one of those kinds of suburbs that the FHA created that I described before. This white homeowner had an African-American friend who was living in downtown Louisville, renting an apartment, had a wife and a child. He was a decorated Navy veteran, had a decent income, wanted to buy a single-family home. Nobody would sell him one. So the white homeowner in this suburb of Louisville bought a second home in his community and resold it to his African-American friend. The only way you could buy one. The African-American family moved in. An angry white mob surrounded by the police, protected by the police rather, surrounded the home, threw rocks through the windows. The police made no effort to stop it. They dynamited and firebombed the home. The police made no effort to stop it. But when the riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year sentence the white homeowner for sedition, for having sold a home in a white neighborhood to a black family. And I said to myself, the police are state agents. The courts are state agents. The prosecutors, the whole criminal justice system is state agents. This isn't de facto segregation. This must be something, I said to myself, this must be something about the history of Louisville that Chief Justice John Roberts doesn't understand. And that's when I began to look into it further. I found that there were hundreds and hundreds of examples in this country in the post-war period into the 1960s, even 70s, of police-protected, sometimes even police-organized and led violence designed and effective in doing so to drive African Americans out of homes that they had legitimately purchased or rented in white communities. Every one of these was a 14th Amendment violation of the police. The segregation of Louisville is not de facto. This was just one of many, many federal, state, and local policies that were implemented. And that's what got me to look into it further. And I found it wasn't only state-sponsored violence that ensured that African Americans and whites could not live near one another in any metropolitan area, but there were many, many of these policies that we talked about, just a few of them so far.
Richard, the fact that the Supreme Court, that in this case Roberts, was so blind to this reality is by itself stunning. But you cite another example, I think, of almost the identical jurisprudence, court decision. I believe it's a Potter Stewart in the 1960s with respect to Detroit, which is probably even more stunning in its way, because again, the question came to the court, should there be remedies for the segregation? And as you just explained, if the segregation results from government policy, as indeed it does, then there have to be remedies. But if it just happened, then there don't. And in that decision, just like Roberts' decision, the court said, well, this just happened. This wasn't the result of government. But as you point out in the book, the lower court had explicitly found in the fact base of the situation that this was de jure, that is government-caused segregation. So the Supreme Court willfully neglected the absolute clear statement of the lower court and just declared it just happened, nobody's responsible. Rather stunning, isn't it? It's amazing.
Well, it's stunning only if you have a misplaced faith in the Supreme Court.
Well, also growing up at the time of the Warren Court, Earl Warren Supreme Court, it was bred in me to have faith in the Supreme Court. Of course, it gets knocked about with lots of counter examples. But when it's so striking that the Supreme Court is to base decisions on the fact base, which is what a lower court develops, and then completely neglects the fact base to make an assertion about the facts, it's more blatant than I'm used to.
Well, one of the things that's curious is that the Warren Court was an aberration in the history of this country. It lasted only for about 15 years at the most, where it took these constitutional rights seriously. And but it had such a powerful impact on the thinking of intellectuals and scholars that people remain surprised that other periods the Supreme Court did not have this view. The fact is that throughout American history, the Supreme Court has been one of the primary defenders of the violation of the rights of African Americans. The Warren Court was a brief period in this country's history where it had a different view. And we should not be misled by taking this one brief 15-year period and thinking that that's the norm. That's not the norm. The norm is the opposite.
Such an important point. The United States, we understand, was a slave society, then an apartheid society, and it was constructed by law. And so the Supreme Court necessarily played a role. And to go back and read, as I've done, again, prompted by The Color of Law and by Trump, and thinking about this, to go back to read decisions like the Dred Scott decision in 1857, which said there is no way that an African American could be considered a citizen in this country. Are you kidding? It wasn't just about a return of slaves. It was the general consideration that, as the Chief Justice said, it's unthinkable that an African American could be a free person and a citizen in the United States. Or Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 on separate but equal schools, or the cases that you cite on overlooking de jure segregation. It's so poignant what you say. I've not put it in those terms in my own mind, that the Warren Court was from the mid-1950s to the late 1960s. It did so much. It was my formative years growing up as a young person. So for me, Brown versus Board of Education, or the decisions upholding the civil rights legislation of the mid-1960s, I thought that's what a Supreme Court does. But you're right that it is, in historical terms, aberrational. So let's talk a little bit about American history in this. You've brought us through the post-Civil War amendments, and we vaguely know, even if we're not the scholar you are on the history, that after the short period of Reconstruction in the South became an apartheid society, Jim Crow society. But your book explains that that was a national phenomenon, and that as African Americans migrated to the North, starting in the 20th century, mainly World War I, World War II, that same apartheid spread throughout the nation. We've learned this year more than we remembered, or perhaps knew, but should have known, how racist Woodrow Wilson was. And you talk about Wilson as introducing segregation into the federal employment system. Maybe you could say a word about Woodrow Wilson, since his name just came off the School of Public Policy at Princeton for these reasons, and to pick up the story around the Wilson administration in the early 20th century, and then onward to World War II. And then I want to talk about all of these mechanisms that you list for how this apartheid was enforced.
Well, you bring up the Wilson administration, and I'll talk about that. But I wrote about that for a different reason, not because I was interested in Wilson. Wilson, as you know, was the first Southern segregationist Democrat to be elected to the presidency after the Civil War. Of course, he had moved to New Jersey, and that was the perch from which he rose to the presidency, but he was a Southerner. Prior to Wilson's presidency in 1913, the federal civil service was an integrated civil service. Blacks and whites working in integrated settings. It was a small civil service. We didn't have the large federal government that we had today, but it was an integrated civil service. And the Wilson administration embarked on a program to segregate for the first time the federal civil service. They put up curtains in federal office buildings to separate black and white clerical workers. They fired African Americans who were in supervisory positions because it was no longer permitted for an African American civil servant to supervise a white civil servant. So these were dismissed. These people were dismissed. They built separate washroom facilities for African Americans in basements of federal office buildings. Well, the reason I told this story was because one of the largest federal departments at that time was the Navy Department. And the official responsible for segregating the Navy Department's offices was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, who was Franklin Roosevelt. Now, I'm not suggesting, I didn't suggest in the book that segregating the Navy Department was FDR's idea, Franklin Roosevelt's idea. I don't even know if he liked it. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. The point is that this was the environment of the Democratic Party in which he grew up, in which he matured, in which he became a politically powerful leader of the Democratic Party. And so it's not surprising that the New Deal, the Democratic administration of FDR, implemented policies of segregation throughout the country. Now, African Americans, as you probably know, did not, on the whole, support the election of FDR in 1932. They voted for Herbert Hoover, the Republican, because the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln, the party that had emancipated slaves. The Democratic Party was the party of segregation. By 1936, African Americans flipped in President Roosevelt's first term as first reelection. And they flipped because the federal government, for the first time in history, gave economic benefits to African Americans. They were always segregated. But the Republicans were not the party of segregation, but they're also not the party of economic security. Mm-hmm. The Democrats were the party of economic security on a segregated basis. And African Americans voted for the party that gave them employment benefits, that gave them housing, always on a segregated basis. You know, you mentioned the South and how this is not a Southern problem. It's not at all a Southern problem. It's a national problem, and it's particularly acute in the North. And in The Color of Law, as you know, you've read the book, I like where I can to talk about some self-satisfied smug places that think they're better than others. Cambridge, Massachusetts.
By the way, that one hit home. We both have Harvard roots.
Right.
I took off my headphones because I was listening to the audiobook and turned to my wife and said, Cambridge, my God, our Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Right. Well, the area between Harvard and MIT in the 1930s was a fully integrated community, a Central Square neighborhood. For the reasons I talked about before, that we had integrated neighborhoods in that period of time. The federal government went into that Central Square neighborhood, demolished integrated housing, and built two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed. And with other public projects elsewhere in the Boston metropolitan area, contributed to it as well. In San Francisco, this is something that happened throughout the country. Hundreds of thousands of workers, black and white, flocked to centers of war production during World War II to take jobs in war industries that hadn't previously existed. They overwhelmed the communities to which they migrated to take these jobs. And the federal government, if they wanted the war material to be produced, the tanks, the ships, the aircraft carriers, the planes, it had to provide housing for workers in these war plants, and it did, everywhere, creating segregated housing for war workers who were working in the same war plants, in the same shipyards. I mentioned San Francisco because the West Coast did not have a substantial African-American population before World War II. Historians divide up the migration of African Americans out of the former slaveholding states into the rest of the country into two big periods. The first great migration around World War I did not affect the West Coast. Very few African Americans came to the West Coast at that time. It was only the second great migration that began in World War II. So when African Americans came to take jobs in the shipyards and in other war industries on the West Coast, there were very few African Americans already living. There was no pattern of segregation. The federal government created that pattern of segregation de novo on the West Coast. In San Francisco, The federal government built 5 projects for shipyard workers. 4 were for whites only. 1 was for African Americans, placed in the neighborhood that then became the black neighborhood of San Francisco. Same thing happened in Los Angeles. Watts was not a black neighborhood before World War II. It became a black neighborhood because that's where the federal government placed housing for war workers at the Douglas Aircraft Plant in Santa Monica, in Seattle, in Portland, up and down the West Coast. That's why it's a segregated society today on the West Coast, solely because of these policies of the federal government during World War II to create segregated patterns where they hadn't previously existed. And Berkeley is another good example of that, where there was a segregated project in Berkeley and in the suburb just north of Berkeley called Albany, where the whites were given buildings in the residential area, and the African Americans were given separate buildings in the industrial area, even though they were working in the same shipyards.
What is so stunning, first of all, you mentioned these, what for some of us are iconic sites, Berkeley, California, with the radical movement, or Cambridge, Massachusetts, completely in the same segregated mode. And so that is one point. But I think one of the overpowering parts of The Color of Law is your careful description of how many ways the segregation is created and enforced. And I just wanted to, I made a list, public housing and its location, the federal home agency, FHA, and who it would give loans to, only to whites, and for building all white properties, local home authorities at the local level that are given state power to enforce segregation, local referenda that enforce segregation, slum clearance policies where African-American communities were destroyed willfully or gutted to clear the way for white communities, the location of the interstate highway system, taking tactical approaches to block African-American communities or exclude them, racial zoning laws, racial covenant laws defended by the courts or even required, toxic waste siting in African-American communities, the environmental injustice, the Veterans Administration segregating the housing for returning veterans, the government support for blockbuster tactics of real estate agents, the tax-exempt status that the IRS granted to discriminatory institutions. What you pointed out a few minutes ago, the state-sanctioned violence where the police stand around as or arrest the African Americans when there are mobs attacking them. Then the job discrimination, hiring, training, wage levels, the tax assessments. Well, my God, it is, I think the overwhelming message is this is an apartheid system. This is not an accident. It is not localized. It is not a perversity. It is a system. And what, I'm sorry to say how naive, I was about some of this, having lived through it all my life and seen it and bemoaned it. We talk about how whites supported Trump disproportionately, and the bigotry that he represented in his administration, that the suburbs went for Trump, I should say. But then you realize from your book, the suburbs were created for exactly that reason. It's not incidental that suburbs vote for racist policies. The suburbs were created for the purpose of segregation. So this is our legacy politically. You've talked about our legacy economically. You've talked about our legacy in terms of wealth distribution in the economy. But our political legacy is we created the very divisions of structure between the urban, mostly, quote, blue or Democratic voting areas and the suburban white Republican voting areas that support the ongoing apartheid system, as it were.
Well, yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Anyway, I found it just chapter after chapter. If it doesn't work this way, try it the next way, because it's bound to work one of these ways.
Well, it worked in all of those ways.
Yeah.
Every one of these, as I said at the very beginning, every one of these was a piece of a system. No one of which would have been enough on its own, but it was a system of federal, state, and local policy zoning regulations at the local level that were explicitly racial, or even if not explicitly so clearly intended to be racial, it was a system at all levels of government where each part reinforced the other.
Let's turn to the crucial discussion at the end about remedies. You say if the government has created this, the Constitution requires remedies.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a huge debate in this country. There are proponents of reparations. You say you don't want reparations, but you want effective remedies. There are those who say we want race-blind solutions, but we should move more towards social inclusion in our health and housing and other policies. Could you lay out this debate and where you come down on it?
Well, I think when you say I don't support reparations, it's because reparations are typically misunderstood.
Or you don't support the word, I should say.
Right,
You support the word remedy.
That's right, because most people think of reparations as a single monetary payment to the current generation. And it would inevitably be token. It would never, I mentioned before, the enormous wealth gap that's been created between African Americans and whites. No reparations program would be substantial enough on its own to close that. So it would be a token payment, and people would say that, okay, we've now taken care of it. Let's move on. We don't need to do anything more. So, as you say, I'm in favor of remedies, which include, in some cases, substantial expenditures, but also many policies that require no expenditures at all. So, for example, let me give the example of the suburbization that we've been talking about as one of these policies. The suburbs that sold at the mid-20th century for $100,000 a piece were homes sold for that amount to white homeowners, and now we're selling for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. We should have an affirmative action program in housing that, for example, the federal government should be buying up homes in a place like Levittown for what they currently cost, market rates, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, and reselling them to qualified African Americans for something closer to the $100,000 that they would have paid, that their families would have paid had they been permitted to buy them. That would be a narrowly targeted remedy for a very specific constitutional violation. It would be expensive, but it would be narrowly targeted as a remedy for a very specific constitutional violation. Something that costs nothing at all would be a program that prohibited zoning ordinances that effectively exclude working class, middle class African Americans from all white suburbs. I think, I'm not a lawyer, but unfortunately I know more about the law in this area than many lawyers do.
And certainly than the Supreme Court does.
Yeah, so it seems to me that a zoning ordinance that perpetuates an unconstitutionally created segregation is itself subject to challenge. And zoning ordinances that prohibit in all white single-family home suburbs, even townhouses, garden apartments, low-level multifamily units that would easily fit into the residential environment, duplexes, triplexes. Zoning ordinances prohibit those, are perpetuating an unconstitutionally created segregation and should be challenged on that basis. That costs nothing at all to do that. So we have a range of policies that should be enacted. I'm now working on a sequel book in which will be about what we do about it.
Great.
Having
Okay.
talked about
we'll come back to discuss that one.
But I'm also, let me say also, if I can make this plug, I'm also working with a group of national civil rights and fair housing leaders to create something that we call a new movement to redress racial segregation. And its theme is that the policies to remedy this, there's no political support for them at this point. There's the things I just described cannot be enacted because there's no political support, but there's a possibility of building political support. We had, in this last year after the George Floyd murder and Black Lives Matter demonstrations across the country, some 20 million Americans taking part in racial justice demonstrations. For the first time in American history, many of them were white. Most of them were white, often led by African Americans, but the participants were overwhelmingly white if you talk about that 20 million. So we're having a more accurate and passionate discussion about race now than we ever have had in American history, really. And so what this new movement to redress racial segregation is attempting to do is create local committees to begin to take action in their local communities to begin the process of redressing segregation and creating the political basis for a national and first local and then national policy. The federal government, as I said, was primarily responsible for these policies, but they couldn't have done it without the willing participation, and I mentioned Levitt before, but of banks, of real estate agencies, of developers. And in any community, those banks and real estate agencies and developers are frequently still in existence today.
Of course.
Those private institutions have an obligation to create voluntary reparations funds, if you want, to subsidize the movement of African Americans into those communities that are now all white. And in African American neighborhoods where those banks refused to issue conventional mortgages to African Americans and push them into exploitative contract sales that gave them no equity and that forced them out of homes from missing a single payment. Those banks have an obligation to take steps to redress segregation in low-income Black neighborhoods as well. So there are many, many policies at the local level that we can begin with to create a stronger political base for remedies. There was a civil rights movement in the 1960s that made good trouble, as the late John Lewis said, to make it possible to enact policies to redress segregation. And I think that the Black Lives Matter demonstrations indicate that there is the possibility today for the similar kind of political support if it's mobilized properly.
I want us to end on that positive and exciting note. Thank you for the coming sequel. Thank you for helping to lead a new movement to redress racial injustice. The book club has listeners from all over the world. I'm sure that this discussion resonates in so many parts of the world because injustices across ethnic, racial, and religious lines are pervasive in the world. It seems to be hardwired in our mental apparatus, but it can be overcome by conscious awareness of justice and by knowledge of the history which your book has done. I want to give a plug in closing also, since we are a worldwide book club. We will have in 2023 the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a marvelous document made possible by Eleanor Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt's wondrous wife, who championed racial justice and economic justice. And the Universal Declaration calls for justice for all, dignity for everybody, irrespective of race, religion, ethnicity, class, gender. And we have a chance worldwide, as part of what you are leading also, Richard, to reinvigorate this universal recognition of human dignity and human rights, and to put justice for all as a center of the global scene as well. Let me thank you again for a remarkable book, a remarkable history. Now you've whetted our appetite for the sequel, and I'm going to demand a repeat conversation with you as soon as you are ready. That's very exciting news to hear. Let me thank all of the people listening to this podcast and all the members of the book club, and to remind you that we will be listening to the world's great historians and thinkers, as we have today with Richard Rothstein, in coming months. Next month, we also will discuss a remarkable book by a remarkable historian. The book on March 24th will be Rashid Khalidi's book, my colleague at Columbia University, The 100 Years' War on Palestine, another story of racial and ethnic injustice, and a very, very remarkable book, also personalized with Professor Khalidi's family history, in the context of this conflict that continues to rage, and the injustices that continue to occur in the Israel-Palestine divisions. So that's March 24th. And throughout the year, we will have exciting speakers. Richard, thank you so much for being with us today. What an honor and what a pleasure. And thank you for your historian's keen eye on helping us to understand our own country, and for your leadership to redress these injustices. We're really grateful.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey.
Great. Thanks to be with you. And thanks to all in the book club. We'll see you and be with you next month.